Mark Henry, CEO of BHP, and I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the country of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay respects to elders past, present and future. Now, right around the world, BHP's operations are intrinsically tied to First Nations communities, and we have deep respect for their heritage and their connection to country. Now, in addition to that, I want to acknowledge all of those people who've been impacted by Cyclone Seroja this week. It's been heartbreaking to see the devastation that the cyclone has wrought, and our heart goes out to all those people whose families, homes and livelihoods have been impacted by the cyclone. Now, I do want to extend a very special welcome here today to three very special guests, Prime Minister Morrison, Attorney General Cash, and local member and Assistant Minister for Vocational Education, Training and Apprenticeships, Steve Irons, and he's been a very big supporter of the program that we have underway and everything that we're trying to achieve as a business. Now, what you see here at the Future Fit Academy is part of a commitment that BHP made last year to 3,500 apprenticeships and traineeships over the next 5 years. And already at our Future Fit Academies here at Welsh School and in Mackay, we have over 450 students. And of those students, over 80% are female, and over 20% identify as Indigenous Australians. Average age is under 30. Now, this is part of BHP's efforts to rebuild from the pandemic, but also to build a very highly skilled workforce that is able to that is workforce ready and is able to support a prosperous nation. BHP has around 45,000 people here in Australia, and we support tens of thousands of further jobs through the supply chain. Now, we've worked with others throughout the course of the pandemic to overcome some of the challenges the pandemic has posed, and that's included us embarking on this sort of commitment. We've hired in more people, we've provided financial support to local communities, to small, local and Indigenous businesses. And the Future Fit Academy is part of a $350 million commitment to 3,500 apprenticeships and traineeships. But we've also committed to spending over $450 million with Australian met sector companies because we're trying to stimulate homegrown innovation. This is all perfectly aligned with the government's one, call for a business-led recovery, which we are fully supportive of, and secondly is the strong focus that the government has on skills and training as being central to the nation's future. We believe that by everybody throughout the economy coming together to work on building skills and on education, that's something that can enable Australia to continue to do what Australia does so well, which is harness its natural ability to provide the world with the resources, the knowledge, and the services that it needs. And with that, Prime Minister, I'll hand across to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's great to be here with you, and particularly great to be here with all of your team, the Trailblazers, who are here in the first program of this wonderful initiative, which is putting Australians into work, keeping them work, and providing them with a career which will support them and their families and their communities for a long time to come. Before I come to that, though, and joined by my colleagues, can I just extend on behalf of the Commonwealth Government and all Australians to all those in Kalbarri that we are standing with you. This morning at 8 o'clock, the phone lines opened on 1802266 that will provide that disaster recovery payment support to people affected in those areas. That's $1,000 per adult and $400 per child. These are critical support payments in a time like this. And you can call that number. Your application is dealt with over the phone. There's no need for lots of paperwork. The Commonwealth Government, through Services Australia, has become very experienced through so many of the disasters we've experienced over the course of the last few years, whether it's floods, whether it's fires, whether it's cyclones, indeed many of the other events that have impacted on so many Australians. And just as Australians were there for those who were affected by those natural disasters, so Australians will be there for those affected by the cyclone at Kalbarri. I'm looking forward to going in a couple of days' time to be able to see firsthand on the ground and see what additional support we can provide. Later today, I'm meeting with the Premier to discuss further supports. I appreciate the way, once again, that the Premier and I and our agencies and our ministers have worked closely together on coordinating the response to this cyclone, just as we do on so many other disasters that sadly we've had to deal with over such a long period of time. So these systems are there to support people. And you know, one of the things that happens during these disasters, Australians who've never had to reach out for support before, very self-sufficient, I know how self-sufficient Western Australians are, reach out. The support is there for you at a time like this. And so please make that support available to you by reaching out and calling that number today, and you'll get a swift response. And we're very pleased to do that element, as we will be doing many others in concert with the state government. Now, of course, this afternoon when I meet with the Premier, we'll be talking about many other issues, but one issue that is not in dispute and never will be, and that is the GST deal for Western Australia. This is a deal that as Treasurer I sponsored, as Prime Minister I legislated. And the one person you can trust any more with this deal is the person who actually brought it about, and that's me. And the Premier and I share a passion for this, and we work together to achieve this. I argued it on the West Coast, and more importantly, I argued it on the East Coast. I said the same thing in Sydney as I've said in Perth. I've said the same thing throughout Western Australia as I said in North Queensland and in South Yarra. And that is how you approach this. We did it because it was the right thing to do. It was a wrong that needed to be righted in Western Australia. And we were very pleased as a government to both take that initiative, to argue the case and to get it done. Now, of course, one of the many other areas we'll be discussing this afternoon is the ongoing economic plan, recovery plan for Australia, but particularly for Western Australia. Over the course of this pandemic, the Premier and I have worked very closely together with a series of initiatives. Of course, the Western Australian government has done a great job keeping people safe here in WA, and we support those initiatives. But equally, the federal government has been there every step of the day, every step of the way, I should say. More than $13 billion, that's more than $1 billion a month that the federal government has pumped into the Western Australian economy in income and other direct supports alone. So that was in JobKeeper, that was in cash flow support, that was in additional support through the COVID supplement, that was the support that was provided direct to our pensioners and other beneficiaries in the economic stimulus. That doesn't even take into account the more than 5,000 flights that were facilitated here in Western Australia, the more than 50,000 tonnes of exports that have been supported through the international freight system that the federal government subsidised. That was our job. And it is true that, of course, the federal government's fiscal support, financial support, not just to Western Australia, but the entire country has more than doubled the state's combined investment. But that was our job. That's what we had to do, and that's what we are doing. And I can continue to reassure Western Australians that those two things working in partnership, health and the economy, has ensured that Western Australia is in the strong position it is now. But as we rebuild, and this is why we're here now, the economic recovery depends on a very critical component, and that is our workforce, and on critical sectors like the minerals and resources sector. This is such a fundamental sector for Australia, and I think Australians are in no doubt about the support and priority that my government places on the resources sector, and particularly here in Western Australia. We need the people to come and work in this growing sector, whether it's the associates who are being trained here, coming from so many different sectors, to be part of the workforce of the future of our resources sector, the engineers that need to be trained, the others who we need to be coming into this sector to build the wealth and prosperity that the Western Australian resources sector has always delivered for our nation. That must continue, and not just here in Western Australia but across the country. And that means training people and getting the right workforce. And I really want to thank Mike Henry and BHP for the groundbreaking, for the leadership program that they have put in place here. It's a great thrill to be here today, particularly with Michaelia and Steve, the ministers who at that time were my skills ministers and have put so much work into building these new job trainer platforms and the apprenticeship programs, which has kept young people in work and is training more people for work. And when Mike and I talked about this quite a while ago, they said, we're going to do this, and we're going to set up this place, and we're going to train Australians from all different backgrounds to come and work in our sector. And BHP has put their money where their mouth is, and they've put their experience where their mouth is too, and they're raising up a whole nother workforce for the future of the Western Australian resources industry. I want to commend them for that. This is such a big part of our economic recovery plan. The job trainer program itself is $1 billion investment in this year alone, some 300,000 training places on top of what we already invest in every year between the federal and state governments to get Australians trained. At the start of the pandemic, one of my greatest concerns and fears for the economy is that apprentices would lose their jobs. This would be heartbreaking, not just at a personal level, but the training and the effort that had been put into training people for a new career. They could have been 2, 3 years into their apprenticeships, making the sacrifices, getting to TAFE, doing the work, and that would all go. And one of the first initiatives I put in place was to support apprentices to stay in their jobs. And as I've moved around the country, and so pleased to be seeing the same thing here in Western Australia, those apprentices kept their jobs. And not only that, our Boosting Apprenticeships program added more apprentices. We tried to get 100,000 new apprentices employed. We thought it would take us 12 months. We did it in 5. And so we've accelerated the program even further, because we understand that building the workforce of the future for Australia in critical sectors, whether it's in the resources sector, whether it's in the agricultural food processing, whether it's in the energy sector, or any of these critical sectors that we've identified, especially in our manufacturing industries, that's where we need to put the effort, getting the workforce, and we're investing in the skills. Now, finally, before I throw over to Michaela and we can take questions, today's vaccination numbers are an improvement. We have seen some 60,000 people vaccinated yesterday. That's up from the previous day. And particularly after the advice that we'd received from the Technical Advisory Group on immunisations regarding the remote risk that it was associated with AstraZeneca. To see those numbers pick up that next day was an encouragement, but we're a long way to go yet. I've called together the premiers and the chief ministers for us to work together to deal with the problems we have in the vaccination program, which stem from 2 issues. The first one was the constraint in the supply from overseas for our doses of those imported vaccines. We had 3 million that was supposed to turn up in those first few weeks, and because of the problems in Europe, they did not arrive. But we were getting over the top of that problem, and the second issue that has come from outside the government's control is the medical advice regarding those remote risks associated with AstraZeneca. That will change how we do the rollout. But the critical thing right now is we must be vaccinating those most vulnerable in our community. That means those who are in those 1A and 1B groups, and particularly, I want to stress, those Australians aged over 70. AstraZeneca is a safe and approved vaccine for people aged over 50. And the risk to elderly Australians and vulnerable Australians of COVID is great if there is an outbreak. Now, we will do everything we can to avoid an outbreak, but as we saw in Victoria, that cannot always be guaranteed. And those who we lost most, almost exclusively, were the elderly in Victoria when that outbreak occurred. So our goal right here, right now, is to ensure that we continue to progress forward with vaccinating that most vulnerable population. We have the vaccines to do that through AstraZeneca. They are being produced, and we're getting on with that job. The second challenge is to deal with those under 50 and those in the next phase who are between the ages of 50 and 70. I'll be talking and working with the states to look at the options for mass vaccination, firstly in the instance of those aged between 50 and 70 and the AstraZeneca vaccines that we have available. Good news on the general practitioners is that we now have 4,000 of those GP sites established. We flagged that at the beginning of this week, that we would be ramping that up further, and that has occurred. And we welcome the good performance, the great performance of our GPs. And I'm looking forward to meeting with the AMA President here in Perth this week to talk about those issues. And we're seeing the number of vaccinations through those GPs that went to 40,000 or thereabouts yesterday. In total, we're just shy of 1.3 million people who have been vaccinated as of the close of yesterday. Now, all of that, I think, indicates that here in Western Australia, this weekend, people will go along to their favourite sporting events, they'll gather together with their families, there'll be community festivals, there'll be all of these things. That's how we're living life here in Australia, and it's how we're living life here in Western Australia. That is not the experience of so many countries around the world today. Of course, we're appreciative of that, but we can't be complacent about it, and that's why we'll need to continue to work. But I think this is reflected in the consumer confidence figures today that have come out from Westpac, up more than 6%, to be at its highest level in 11 years. Australians can see that Australia is coming through this pandemic and through the recession that has caused better than almost any other country in the world today. We are in a handful of countries to be living in this position. We intend to keep it that way. I intend to keep it that way by working with industry, by working with the state premiers, in particular here Premier McGowan, to ensure that we keep keeping Australia in the position we want them to be in. I'll pass over to Makati and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And ladies and gentlemen, it is just fabulous to join my friend and colleague Steve Irons, the member for Swan, here today at the BHP Future Fit Academy. And Prime Minister, on behalf of all of us, it is great to have you here in Western Australia. In the first instance, Prime Minister, can I thank you for the support that both you have shown personally, but also on behalf of the Commonwealth Government for Western Australians that have been affected by the recent cyclone. And I acknowledge that you are meeting with Premier McGowan today in relation to that support. Can I also, though, on behalf of Western Australians, thank you for standing here today as the former Treasurer of our great country, but now as the Prime Minister, and reaffirming your commitment to that GST deal. As you said, when you were Treasurer, you recognised that there was a wrong that needed to be righted. You fought for that to happen, both on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And I really do acknowledge those comments you are making here today as the Prime Minister and your commitment to that GST deal. Can I also, though, say to Steve Irons, when Steve and I worked together in the skills portfolio, the Prime Minister made it very clear to us. Skills and workforce, they are centre to the economic recovery from COVID-19. And it is just great to join Mike Henry and the team here at BHP today to have a look at exactly what they are doing to lead Australians in terms of that recovery. As the Prime Minister said, when COVID-19 hit, first and foremost, our thoughts went to, in particular, apprentices and trainees. We did not want them to lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic. And that's why, as a government, we moved so quickly to put in place the Supporting Apprentices and Trainees wage subsidy. And we were so successful in keeping apprentices and trainees on the job. But what the Prime Minister also recognised, working with Steve Irons and myself, was that we also needed to get that pipeline of apprentices going. And as I look around here today, it is just fantastic to be surrounded by so many apprentices working in the resources sector. In terms of the Building Apprentices Commencement Wage Subsidy, it is a 50% wage subsidy provided to employers across Australia, any size, any industry, anywhere, to bring on a new apprentice into their business. We've set ourselves a goal as a government. We wanted to see 100,000 new commencements of apprentices and trainees within a 12-month period. I was delighted, Steve was delighted, and I know the Prime Minister was delighted when we hit that 100,000 within 5 months of the program being put in place. And as a result of that, we extended the program. So any employer across Australia, any size, any industry, anywhere, who signs up and takes on a new apprentice right up until September 30 this year, they will have the benefit of the 12-month 50% wage subsidy. And then when we look at what BHP at the Future Fit Academy have created here, Prime Minister, it is just great that when you come back to Western Australia, we are literally surrounded by those who work in the backbone of the Western Australian economy, the resources sector. And to BHP, I really do commend you on this innovative program, the Future Fit Academy, that you have in place, and in particular the feedback that we've received from the apprentices and the trainees who are here today, employees of BHP, undertaking their apprenticeship or trainee, and when they finish, going straight off to site. What we see here today really is workforce planning being done well. We are seeing quite literally that business-led recovery that we need to see. And Prime Minister, it's just great to join Steve Irons and to be able to showcase, in particular, apprentices and trainees to you here today.
Thanks, Matthias. Thank you also, Steve. Steve and I came into the Parliament together many years ago. We looked a little bit different back then, Steve, but I want to thank you for the great work you've been doing here in Perth. Questions?
Prime Minister, Christine Holgate has she's accused you of bullying her over the Watches scandal. Will you apologise?
Well, I said earlier today, the events that occurred in the Parliament last year, about October of last year, related to a very serious issue. evidence had been given on two matters. One was that Cartier watches had been handed out to well-paid employees who are also entitled to performance bonuses under their normal remuneration arrangements. And on top of that, in a government-owned, taxpayer-owned company, Cartier watches were handed out on top of that. I didn't think that was appropriate. I still don't think it was appropriate. When that occurred, it was also stated that this was not taxpayers' money. I disagreed with that statement very strongly too. If it's a government company, it is taxpayers' money, and it should be treated with the same level of respect across government organisations as well. And so those are points that I remain very firmly committed to. At the time, what I did was I spoke to the shareholding ministers. That was in particular Minister Fletcher. Minister Fletcher spoke to the chairman of the company. The chairman of the company spoke to the chief executive. What we undertook to do was put a review into place into these matters that we considered to be very concerning. And the instruction was that the chief executive would stand aside while that was being done. What I stated in the parliament was if the chief executive, and the indication had been that this might be the case, was not prepared to stand aside, and then that she might wish to leave the company. I reflected that in the parliament. Now, it was a willing day in the parliament. The language in the parliament was very strong. It was not my intention to cause distress to Christine Holgate, and I regret any distress that strong language may have caused to her, indeed did cause to her. That was not my intention. But what this issue is about, ultimately, all of us who serve in senior positions, whether it's as Prime Minister, a Minister, or a Chief Executive or Managing Director of a government-owned company, we all have responsibilities. What this issue was about the appropriate way that taxpayers' money and taxpayer companies are run. And so there were serious issues there, and Ms Holgate decided not to remain with Australia Post, and Australia Post is now moving to appoint a new Chief Executive, and any remaining issues sit between Christine Holgate and the Chair.
Please don't believe
that your words in Parliament made her position untenable. Were you trying to score political points?
No, I don't accept that. The position was that Ms Holgate, Christine Holgate, would be able to stand aside while that review took place. She chose not just to do that, she chose ultimately, while the review was underway, to resign from the company. That was a matter between her and the chairman. If she'd wished to stay in the organisation while that review was concluded, and that the board and her could work through any of the serious issues that were raised in that review. There were serious matters here, and serious issues that we didn't want to see repeated. And if she'd chosen to work through that process, then she could have chosen to do that. Instead, she chose to resign from the organisation. That's a matter between her and the Australia Post board. My language in the parliament on the day that the Labor Party was saying that she should be resigned, I remind everybody, that was the context of those discussions in the parliament, and what was said later. Parliament can get very willing, and on that occasion my language was very strong, and I do regret the distress that would have caused to Ms Holgate.
If you regret it, do you owe her an apology?
Minister, will you meet with Brittany Higgins when she travels to Canberra to take part in the Kate Jenkins review? And will you apologise to her in person for the alleged treatment that she suffered in Parliament House?
Well, I've already made those apologies publicly, and I'm very looking forward to meeting with Brittany. We'll be meeting privately. Where that will take place, that hasn't been arranged yet, but we'd reached out to Brittany Higgins to arrange that meeting, like I said we would, and we have, and those arrangements are put in place. That'll be a private conversation. I'm looking forward to having it. I know there are a range of issues that she's relayed to my Chief of Staff that she would like to raise, and I look forward to hearing her.
Admitting that you caused distress to Christine Holgate, do you have a problem with the way you speak about women?
No. This issue wasn't about gender. This was about taxpayer organisations handing out Cartier watches to well-paid executives. This has nothing to do with gender. This has to do with the performance of people who are responsible for running taxpayer organisations. That's what this issue is about.
So admitting that you caused her distress, why wouldn't you apologise for that?
I think acknowledging that distress has been caused, I think, is appropriate. But when it comes to these organisations, we all carry big responsibilities, and you know, it can be a very robust environment, and that robust environment shouldn't be taking account of people's genders. It should be treating everybody equally, and that's what I do.
Would you call her and make that? Will you call her and express that one-on-one, not just through the media?
No, I don't think there's a need for that. I mean, the chairman and the former chief executive, that's where that employment relationship existed, and that's where those issues are being addressed.
She says she didn't go voluntarily. Should she get her old job back?
Well, that's a matter between the chair and her. That's not a matter that the government, as ministers or myself as Prime Minister, had any direct involvement in whatsoever.
What's the status of the Boston Consulting Review of Australia Post? Can you guarantee there won't be job losses, as Ms Holgate has said there will be?
I'll refer that to the Minister, and you can raise that with him.
Through that,
managing that matter.
Did the chairman of Australia Post resign?
No, there's nothing before me which suggests that.
through the Boston Consulting Group.
The job maker scheme had only created 609 jobs, well short of the 450,000 predicted. Are businesses like BHP doing the heavy lifting in regards to getting Australians back to work?
All Australians are doing the heavy lifting. I think BHP is doing a tremendous job, and that is are many Australian companies. And if Australian companies don't feel the need to draw on that taxpayer-funded support to do that job, well, that's good news too. I think having profitable companies is a good thing. Profitable companies investing in the training of Australians is a good thing, and where they do that off their own dollar, that's a good thing. And that's the sort of self-reliant economy that the Treasurer and I and my government have been supporting and seeking to build, and have ensured that we've been able to move through this COVID period and to ensure that it is coming out the other side strong. I mean, where there are more people employed in Australia today than there were before when the pandemic hit. Consumer confidence is at an 11-year high. That's good news for a business, it's good news for jobs, and it's evidence of the strong recovery that we're seeing take place coming out of the COVID-19 recession. So I'm not therefore surprised that large companies, where they have the means to actually invest in their futures and in the training, are doing just that, and I welcome that. But there are many small and medium-sized businesses, like those who have come through the apprenticeships program and the boosting apprenticeship program, who have relied very much on that support. And in the past, in the most difficult periods of the pandemic, including here in Western Australia, who were very reliant on those job seeker arrangements, that saw them through. And now they're getting back on their own feet, and they've graduated from that program, and I think that's a good thing. So, you know, everyone's doing their bit of the heavy lifting here. Right throughout the pandemic, that's what I've seen Australians do. People carrying their load, and in many cases, they've sought to carry the load of others. The Commonwealth Government has done that here in Western Australia. The state government has done it here in Western Australia. Local governments have been doing it. Companies, employers, workers, all working together to ensure that Australia is one of a handful of countries that is leading the world out of the COVID-19 pandemic and recession.
One of
Joe
the
Biden said that he's going to withdraw troops from Afghanistan by September 11. Are there any implications from that for Australian personnel in the region?
Well, without going into national security matters, you can be assured that the Australian government has been working closely with our American partners and allies on these issues.
on the vaccination program.
Trips. Are you aware how long it's been since you visited WA?
Yeah, I was last here for the telethon and with Jenny, and we very much enjoyed being there for telethon. And but since that time, a lot has happened. After returning from the United States, in fact, and wasn't here long after that, already in September of last year, we were dealing with bushfires in Queensland. And I remember Jenny and I being up there in Queensland in September, and then through October, and then through November, important meetings with the East Asia Summit up in Thailand, which was the last time I met with Premier Li Keqiang from China. And that was a very important summit that was held in Bangkok. We returned, and the bushfires continued to rage, as they did all through the summer. And then, of course, as we moved into January, we moved into the pandemic. Western Australians needed me to be at the helm of this country, and that's exactly where I was.
Did you abandon the WA Liberal Party?
Absolutely not. And from where we were providing support. And we've got a lot of work to do here at a state level as a party, but I think as Western Australians distinguish very significantly, as we're seeing Australians doing right across the country. What they've seen here in Western Australia is a Premier show strong leadership through the course of the pandemic, supported by a strong federal government that is underwritten through the significant financial investments which have more than outstripped what was able to be done by the Western Australian government.
Have you spoken to the Liberal MPs who lost their seats? Do you know how many seats were lost?
No, that's a matter for the state party. I'm focused on my federal team.
On the vaccination program.
A lot. They're matters for the state party. I'm focused on the federal issues.
If it's replicated, that swing, you would lose at least 4 seats federally, including Steve's, including Christian Porter's. Is it desperate times for the Liberal Party in WA?
No, not at all, because I think Western Australians know that my government and the Liberal Party at a federal level is the party that has ensured that people have stayed in their jobs, that the GST deal, so needed over such a long period of time, was championed by the Liberal Party, by the federal Liberal Party, and has delivered for Western Australians. Indeed, the very surplus that they have in Western Australia can be entirely, at the end of the day, put down to the additional GST payments that the Western Australian government received of $1.5 billion, because it is a surplus of less than $1.5 billion. We have delivered as a federal Liberal team for Western Australia, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in defence contracts, whether it's in JobKeeper or tax cuts or the resources industry, our energy technology roadmap, our trade deals. All of these things have been very important for Western Australia, and they've been delivered by a federal Liberal government. And I trust Western Australians' judgment. They have rewarded the strong leadership of Premier McGowan, and my government has been providing strong leadership for Western Australians as well.
On the vaccine program, the
state election is run and done. I'm focused on delivering for Western Australians.
On the vaccine program, one of the biggest problems is supply. So we're not getting
Sorry,
enough.
I couldn't quite hear you.
On the vaccine program, one of the biggest problems is supply. We're not getting enough overseas doses, and large parts of the population are, of course, being told to get another vaccine. So how will more national cabinet meetings resolve that? And have state and territory leaders agreed to meet 2 national cabinet meetings twice weekly?
Yes, they have, in short. I was in contact with them yesterday, and just like it was last year when we had to deal with many difficult challenges, of course they will come together in the same spirit, and that's why I'm very confident that the issues and problems we're currently beset with will be resolved. There are 2 issues. Initially, the problem was with the supply of overseas vaccines. That's what slowed down those first few weeks until the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was being produced in Melbourne, was able to come off the factory line, to go through the fill and finish process, go through the batch testing and become available. Now, that AstraZeneca vaccine had ramped up to around 800,000 a week. The challenge now is the medical advice that has been received that deals with the rather rare instance where you can have the clotting occur for those who are under 50. I note that in the United States, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is now facing some similar issues. This is why our selection of vaccines was so important. I mean, in recent days, the government has been criticised for not getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Well, that would have been another adenovirus vaccine. We already had one of those, which was AstraZeneca, so we decided to go with the Novavax vaccine and to go with the Pfizer vaccine, an mRNA vaccine. So we ensured that we had coverage over the different types of vaccines, foreseeing that it is possible, although there was nothing in the early testing to suggest this, that any one of those vaccines could potentially have faced one of those challenges. Right now, our focus is principally on vaccinating people for whom the AstraZeneca vaccine does not present a challenge. Of course, there are those under 50 who are working as frontline health workers and aged care workers and others, but a vast number of those are also aged over 50, and the AstraZeneca vaccine is very appropriate for them, and those supplies of AstraZeneca are continuing to roll out. So I haven't finished yet. We don't have an issue with the supply of AstraZeneca vaccines. They are rolling out of our domestic manufacturing. The issue is in relation to the Pfizer vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine timetable that we have from Pfizer is ramping up over the next few weeks and months and into the 3rd quarter of this year. We have secured an additional 20 million Pfizer vaccines that will become available in the 4th quarter of this year, and that will happen at the same time as we expect to receive the Novavax vaccines. So we will have if those supply lines hold up, and that is something outside the government's control, then we will have a substantial number of vaccines in the 4th quarter of this year. That is why we'll have to change our delivery method, because we would like to see this done before the end of the year, but that will only be possible if we can ensure that we have the max vaccination program in place that can do that in that space of that final quarter. Now, prior to that, we will have AstraZeneca vaccines that we believe we might be able to ramp up the pace of vaccination for those aged between 50 and 70. Now, that's millions of Australians. And we have a very strong GP network now of over 4,000 that we can work those vaccines through, but equally there's the option to work, and I've discussed this with at least one Premier, about how max vaccination could be an option earlier, say in June or July, for those over 50 groups that are in the balance of the population, and it's a very large number. And there will be vaccines, we believe, to support that type of activity. Now, that just can't happen overnight, and that's why calling together the states and territories and the premiers for us to deal directly with this as leaders, to ensure we can get those systems in place to understand what the risks are associated with that, what resourcing is required, and to be able to direct those programs as a national cabinet. That's what the meetings are for. Over the course of this week, the health ministers are meeting. They'll be doing that Thursday evening. The medical advisors are meeting this week as well. They'll put a first-pass set of issues before us next Monday. We'll start working through those issues. By the end of the week, we'll meet again, and we will work this problem and we'll solve it.
Just to clarify, it sounds like the...
How long do you see it being necessary to meet twice weekly, and when do you think pharmacists will be involved in the
On the first question, as long as we have to, which is what the issue was last year. We just met as frequently as we needed to and as often as we had to lead the country and to solve the problems. We have another set of problems to solve now, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. And we will solve those problems. The issues for pharmacies, well, we'll have to look at that carefully now as we're recalibrating the whole rollout. And that's what we'll be addressing and working through those issues. At present, they weren't due to be involved until the next phase, so phase 2A and beyond. And that was not due to occur until after mid-year. And we will now need to weigh up the various options that we have with max vaccination centres for those aged over 50, and whether that is a viable option and should be pursued, or we can continue to do that at a sufficient rate using the previous method, which was to be done through GPs and pharmacies. So those arrangements stay with us, and we'll work those issues, and that's what we'll do. I mean, the pandemic has taught us you've got to be practical, you've got to work together, you've got to solve problems. Problems occur that are beyond the government's control. There's a great uncertainty that relates to a lot of this. And that is true all around the world. You know, in Australia, we're living in a way that the rest of the world isn't. And that can lead us perhaps to be thinking that these issues have gone away. They haven't gone away. In the rest of the world, in the United States, they're seeing 70,000 cases additionally of coronavirus every single day. There's 1,000 people dying every day in the United States. That's not Australia. In the United Kingdom, over 30 people are dying every day. Over 1,500 new cases every single day. That is not our reality. That didn't happen by accident. That occurred because Australian governments, led by the federal government, came together and worked these problems and solved them. And that's exactly what we'll do again now. Thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate it.